Governments have done everything to keep these photos secret. They don't want anyone knowing of their existence. Here are the top 15 photos governments don't want you to see. Number 15. The Ayioi Anargyroi military base. It makes perfect sense that countries want to keep details about their military bases secret to prevent enemies from learning about them. But the Greek government has taken that to the next step by even banning aerial shots from being viewable on Google Earth. The Ayioi Anargyroi military base is in central Athens, and while you can clearly see the building that surrounds it, the complex itself is fully blurred out. It's not just images that the Greek government keeps hidden about this place, but operational capacity too. It's thought to be a training facility for new recruits, but may also be where Greek military command headquarters is located. So any photos from ground level or of people entering and exiting the fortified perimeter are strictly prohibited too. Number 14. The Maid of Harlech. In September of 1942, while on a gunnery practice mission before deploying across Europe during the Second World War, an American fighter plane encountered difficulties and crash-landed onto a Welsh beach. Those on board died instantly, and for a long time the Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter aircraft was hidden beneath the water and sand. But in recent years, it has begun to reappear. Known as the Maid of Harlech, images taken by locals are occasionally shared online, but because of the Protection of Military Remains Act, the precise location of the crash site remains classified. For this reason, any photos that give away its location are illegal, and the government continues to insist they are removed in order to treat those who sacrifice themselves with the appropriate level of respect. Number 13. Mount Pony. In 1969, the Federal Reserve opened a 140,000 square foot facility in Culpeper, Virginia, as a place that could store up to $1 billion worth of currency and act as a base of operations should the worst happen. Mount Pony, as it was called, is radiation hardened and surrounded by a 1-foot thick shield of steel reinforced concrete, and was deemed so secure that it also contained the central node for all American electronic money transfers. Today, it's used by the Library of Congress to store their archive of movies, but the government is still protective over any images that are released of it. The facility would likely be repurposed in a time of need, and the less anyone knows about its design, the better. Number 12. Chinese military hardware. Governments around the world like to show off their military hardware to show their civilians and enemies alike how powerful they are. But sometimes they release a little more than they had planned. This happened to China when, in the state-published magazine Modern Ships, an image was included of the new H-6N bomber. While this reveal was definitely on purpose, what they didn't mean to show was a new design of the ballistic bomb that was attached beneath the jet, one that security experts believe was built to help with China's dominance over disputed territories. The publishers immediately retracted the image and said that it was computer-generated and an error, but the photos were soon shared online of the actual jet in operation, and sure enough, they showed the bay where this new weapon will be installed when it goes into operation. Number 11. Tank Man of Tiananmen Square. Still, more than 30 years after the awful events that took place in Tiananmen Square in 1989, Chinese authorities don't acknowledge what happened and, in the weeks leading up to its anniversary every year, embark on a mass censorship campaign to ensure there's no mention of it on state-controlled media or the internet. For us outside of China, the most powerful image from the pro-democracy protests that resulted in the deaths of an estimated 10,000 people is of a man standing in front of a tank and refusing to move. It's so well known, but amazingly very few people inside China would have ever seen it. As far as their government is concerned, it's not part of a history they want them to know about. Number 10. Mexican Asylum Plan. Governments often work on plans that aren't yet ready to be made known to the wider public, but occasionally someone makes a mistake and the policy is revealed way ahead of time. This happened in June of 2019 when President Trump was speaking to reporters about a secret deal that had been struck with the Mexican government that would avoid the introduction of extra tariffs in return for a way to manage immigrants that were arriving at the border. He held the agreement in his hands and waved it around to prove that it was in the works. But he didn't realize that in the bright sunshine, some of the words could be seen through the piece of paper, and one photographer had taken a high-resolution image of it. Everything could be deciphered. Sure, it wasn't the worst breach of national security ever, but it was an embarrassing moment and was one photo that the government most certainly didn't want people to see in advance of the document's official release. Number 9. Russian soldiers in Berlin. Nazi Germany was finally brought to its knees in 1945 thanks to the combined efforts of the Allies. Russian troops were part of this, and they moved into the capital city Berlin around May of that year. This moment has been somewhat controversial because according to some accounts they looted the city and took every item of worth that they could lay their hands on. In 1995 there was an art show in Moscow that displayed work that had been plundered from Berlin, but this brazen encouragement of theft isn't the norm. Usually Russian authorities have tried their best to keep what happened under wraps, which is why this image was so controversial. It shows Russian soldiers raising a flag over the war-torn city, and this became one of the most well-known photos of the time. Problem, though, was that in the original, one of the soldiers was wearing 2 German watches that he had looted. The photographer noticed this and edited them out, along with making the flag look better and adding smoke in the background. Not only because he knew it would detract from the power of the picture, but also because the government most certainly wouldn't have wanted anyone to see it. Number 8. X-37 spaceplane. The US military has developed and tested countless new experimental aircraft over the past few decades. But when one of the most secretive designs ever landed at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the government did its best to prevent any images from leaking. Known as the X-37, it's an autonomously piloted spaceplane and had just completed a highly classified 2-year mission in orbit. Almost looking like a miniature space shuttle, it's about 29 feet long with a wingspan of 15 feet, and there are apparently 2 of them in service. Quite what its purpose is and what technology it's equipped with is not known, and it's a surprise so many images have managed to be shared of it. Is this the first in a line of new spy planes, or does it have a different purpose? It'll be a while until we know for sure, and these images sure don't give any clues away. Number 7. Pine Gap. It's no surprise to hear that countries around the world have secret intelligence facilities, where they process huge amounts of data that are being collected to preemptively deal with any threat that's coming their way. But while the Pentagon in the US is a well-documented and photographed site, other places linked with US intelligence aren't meant to be so well known. One of these is Pine Gap, a surveillance base that's about 11 miles southwest of the Australian town of Alice Springs. It's a crucial link in the US's monitoring of Asia, and they do absolutely everything they can to prevent any images of the site being reproduced, just in case they give away any clues about its operational ability to enemy states. Still, with a TV show based there and the ability to get surprisingly close to it, it's almost inevitable that some photos make their way out. Before we move on, be sure to subscribe to Top 5s with notifications on. Number 6. The Eiffel Tower at night. The Eiffel Tower is one of the most recognizable and photographed landmarks in the world. Opened in 1889 for that year's World Fair, the intent was only for it to be standing for a few years. But it's become so popular that it's still there more than 130 years later. No trip to Paris is complete without seeing it, and it's now illuminated throughout the night so it remains a spectacular sight in the city skyline. But did you know that photos of the iron structure are strictly limited once the sun is set? This is because of strict EU copyright laws that protect the intellectual property of the tower and, most importantly, the rights of the artist who creates the light show that's projected onto it. Pictures can, of course, be for personal use and shared between friends and social media. But if you want to use an image of the tower on a postcard or another tourist trinket to sell, you have to seek permission or note the copyright. Otherwise, you could land yourself in serious trouble. Number 5. Refugee Camps. Governments like to protect the image that everyone in their country is being looked after, no matter who they are. And unfortunately, this often means that some groups are kept as far away from a camera lens as possible. Europe has been facing an unprecedented refugee crisis in the past few years thanks to political unrest beyond the borders, and this has led to an influx of people, including young children who have no place to go apart from the horrific conditions of refugee camps. There are some facilities that media are allowed to access to show the efforts being made to look after these people, but there are others that authorities try their hardest to keep secret. This camp in Dunkirk, France is one of them, and as these images show, people are left to live a life of squalor. Children have nothing to do but kick empty cans about in the mud. There's very little space to move in among the boxes and belongings, and there's such a lack of sanitation that germs and illness quickly spread between the people. In this camp, which houses more than 2,600 people, there are only 2 drinking water stations and 26 chemical toilets, which further compounds the problem in a place where families can spend many months before being offered somewhere else to go. Understandably, the authorities try to restrict images like these from being published to the wider world, but the simpler solution would surely be to improve the conditions in the first place. Number 4. Iranian missile launch failure. In 2019, an Iranian missile test launch went catastrophically wrong and resulted in a large explosion and destruction of the whole facility. It came at a time where relations between the country and the rest of the world were especially tense. President Trump was gleeful at the failure when he shared a satellite surveillance image of the site. There was a problem with the release of this photo, though, which led to condemnation by American military leaders, and that's because of the sharp, clear image that was shown. Satellite imaging capabilities are a highly classified secret because they're currently the most important method to spy on other countries. If anyone knew too much, they could deploy countermeasures and render the technology useless. What might seem like just a picture actually gives away a lot about the satellite that captured it. An astronomer, for example, managed to use the angle to determine which satellite was watching at the time and found it to be USA 224, which is officially classed as an optical reconnaissance satellite. It was about 200 miles above the site at the time and had a 2.5-meter wide optical mirror. Commercial companies are only allowed to release imagery with a 25-centimeter resolution. But based on this image, the satellite has the capability to zoom in to clearly see objects that are less than 10 centimeters wide, which makes it one of the most powerful known surveillance systems to ever be put in operation. Attempts were subsequently made to redact the image, but once it had been tweeted out by the president, there was very little anyone could do. Number 3. North Korea. Since the ceasefire that ended the hostilities of the Korean War, North Korea has become the most secretive and isolated state in the world. Not only are there concerns about their military ambitions, but more importantly, there are questions surrounding their treatment of the civilian population, and information is strictly controlled to allow the regime to protect the image they want of themselves. Visitors to the country are escorted by officials and are only allowed to see pre-vetted places that live up to the ideals the government wants to convey. Photos of anything else are destroyed, but occasionally some make their way out. One of the main types of images that they really don't want you to see are those that show the extent to which child labor is common practice in the country. Kids as young as 4 are put to work in the fields instead of receiving an education, in scenes that would be simply unacceptable in most other places around the world. The poverty experienced by most in the country also means that photographs of signs of wealth are frowned upon. So even though many party officials in Pyongyang drive around in luxury Mercedes cars, they sure don't want you to know about it. There are several other strange rules, such as the way that you can take an image of a statue, but not from behind, and you must never take a photo of the military unless it's for an authorized piece of propaganda. Number 2. Underground British City. The threat of the Cold War brought home the stark reality to many countries that they may suffer nuclear strikes. So top-secret facilities were built that could house and protect those that were deemed important enough to society. In the UK, one of the main sites, called the Burlington Bunker, was near the town of Corsham in Wiltshire, and even though it was declassified in 2004, images are still restricted to those of just the interior, in case it needs to be brought back into use again. It was built in a 240-acre quarry and covered an area underground of 35 acres. There's room for 4,000 staff to survive for 3 months within the 100-foot deep reinforced concrete walls. And there were bedrooms, offices, a hospital, and even a bakery and broadcasting studio that would be used to keep in contact with any survivors who weren't lucky enough to be safely hidden inside. What's amazing is that as this place was never used as intended, it has functioned as a time capsule of technology from the 50s and 60s. There's a telephone exchange which could have been one of the biggest in the world, and ovens and coffee machines that still have their tags on them because they've never been switched on. Amazingly, the site was kept fully ready until 1991, when, following the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was deemed surplus to demands. Still, the site represents British strategic planning during times of difficulty, and that's why photos are still highly controlled. Even though there have been attempts to sell it off with suggestions that it could be turned into a huge wine cellar, or potentially the ideal location for a server farm, if Burlington Bunker or one of the others were built at the same time, ever needs to be used as they were intended. The last thing authorities would want is for people who haven't been invited inside to have access to images to plan the best way to try to break in. Number 1. U.S. nuclear power plants. Nuclear energy is one of the most efficient and cleanest ways of generating power, and there are facilities across the United States. There is, of course, an element of risk involved in running a power plant like this, and you'd expect they're kept to a rigorously high standard, wouldn't you? In 2016, a series of frightening images were released that had been taken inside U.S. nuclear facilities that show the concrete structures in a state of disrepair, with unfinished construction works, trash everywhere, and segments of walls and ceilings that were collapsing. The purpose was to highlight the extra investment that was needed to bring them up to code, especially as many of them are now more than 40 years old. So far, however, very little extra support has been given, and it's thought that many of them look exactly the same many years after these photos were taken. Although the government is now a lot more careful about who has access, so no further images like these are released. Subscribe to Top 5s for more and check out some of our other popular videos.